Welcome to the Painting of the Week podcast, where we look at some of the most significant paintings throughout history. Introducing your hosts, Phil Grabsky and Laura Bentham.
Well, hello. Welcome to this week's Painting of the Week. And we're actually standing outside for this particular episode. We're in Ditchling in East Sussex, not far from where Laura and I live in Brighton. It is a glorious August summer's day, which you can hear from the rain.
Yes.
And we've chosen a slightly unusual and even perhaps controversial choice today, because we are standing next to the war memorial that was designed and sculpted by Eric Gill. If you go onto the 7th-art.com website, you can pull up a picture of the war memorial, or if you're listening to this on the YouTube site, of course, you can already see it. Also, slightly unusually, we have a special guest with us today, an old friend. Janet Laurence is her name. Janet has many, what's the term? Bows to her quiver? No. Is that right?
I don't know.
Quivers to her bow. Anyway, many talents. And a Thursday morning in Ditchling, we'll often see Janet here playing her accordion, which she taught herself at the age of 75 or something extraordinary.
No, I went to a teacher when I was 66.
All right, 66 still, not bad.
I think you could do the whole podcast.
And in Brighton during COVID, she would play outside her house for an hour a day. But Janet also, I met Janet when she was hosting a show on Royal Sussex Hospital Radio. She interviewed me about In Search of Mozart, and we've been friends ever since. And Janet comes to every film and listens to every podcast. And so we thought, actually, as an art lover, we'd bring Janet along to contribute to this conversation. So, just before we properly start, I'll say there's an issue with Eric Gill, which has to be kind of brought to the front straight away, which is his biography and his personal life. And there's elements of it which are horrendous. We'll talk about that in a second, but of course it does raise the question that if an artist has a biographical side to them which is illegal, unpleasant, distasteful, or whatever, does that mean that you then don't talk about them and don't talk about their art? So we'll discuss that, but here we are. So let me start with Laura first of all.
Oh, hello.
Laura, how would you... I mean, you've lived in Sussex a long time.
Yes.
Been to Ditchling many times.
Yes, used to bring the children here to feed the ducks.
Feed the ducks, just because there's a pond
There's a
just
lovely
next.
pond.
I should say we're actually next door to the brilliant, fantastic Ditchling Museum. Actually, the actual title, Ditchling Museum of Art and Craft. And we'll talk about that in a second.
Yeah, there's lots to talk about here.
How would you... Well, did you notice this war memorial? And how would you describe it?
What, when the children were little, or now, even now?
Even now.
Yeah. I will always notice a war memorial, actually, because having two granddads that fought in the war, 100%, I will always notice a war memorial and always take a little bit of time to look at them and remember, for sure. Yeah, 100%, yeah.
So, of course, the thing that's interesting about this one is that in some ways it's very simple.
It is simple.
And obviously reminds me of the cenotaph, which again, they had all sorts of different ideas about how to... You know, if you think of all the different ways you can do a war memorial, this is really, in some ways, quite straightforward, isn't it? It is a block of marble with the names. It's not too elaborate, but for me, it's all the more moving in a way.
Always. But I think they always make them simple. Is that just so that we always contemplate our thoughts and therefore don't distract from your thoughts? Everyone has their own thoughts of a war memorial. So therefore, keep it simple, and then you just have your own thoughts on it.
Janet, Is this a war memorial that you've spotted and thought about in the past?
To be honest, I haven't. You told me about it, and so I read up a little bit about it and was very impressed by the fact that, first of all, it's next to the Ditchling Museum of Art, where Eric Gill's work is being celebrated, and there have been exhibitions of his work. He has been a controversial character, partly because of his personal life, but his work covers paintings, and you'll have to confirm this with me, paintings and sculpture and stonemasonry. And this is where we came to the fact that this monument, there was a decision to appoint the parish council in May 1999 to create a simple stone memorial with the names of the fallen.
1919.
1919.
Yeah.
You edit that out, will you?
No, we don't edit our podcasts, so that
We do sometimes.
no, we don't.
Oh,
We've done 58, and there's only been one edit. So we're not
Sometimes
this
it's
won't be
me
the second.
drinking too much tea.
So in 1919, it came to the attention of the Ditchling Parish Council that a monument should be set up to honour the residents of Ditchling and the young men who were sent to war from this very lovely village.
But did they say to Gill, "This is how we want it. This is how we want it to look," or did he decide? Do you know?
I would guess that he decided, but I can't be sure on that.
Because we should say about Gill that the reason I know his name is because there's a lot of his sculpture in Britain. If you go to Broadcasting House, if you go to St Paul's, there are other war memorials that he's done. And if you go onto your computer and you do the drop-down menu of fonts, you've probably never even noticed or even thought about why it's called this, because some of them have such strange names. But Gill Sans is his. He designed it. And in fact, there's a couple of others that he designed. And again, coming back to the biography, there are people who won't use Gill Sans because it's by Eric Gill. But going back to this war memorial, do you think that the simplicity of it, Janet, is something that appeals to you? Or do you think it could have, because there are plenty of war memorials which will have a sculpture of a soldier with their head bowed, or a woman holding a dead soldier, or, I've just come from a village in France where their war memorial is kind of like a broken arch and a crucifix with Christ on it. And so does this simplicity appeal to you, or do you think it could be more powerful if it had a representation of a fallen soldier or a mourning widow?
I like the simplicity of it because the most important thing about it is the names on it. There's a simple cross at the top, and round the plinth there are actually the rosettes, the poppies that are they're now in plastic, but they're still there for people to see that this is a memorial. It was built in 1919 to honour the soldiers who in Ditchling who were conscripted, went to war from the age of 19 upwards, and from the humble job of a street sweeper up to whatever other profession Ditchling hosted. But I have also learned that later on there are some names from the Second World War on this monument.
Yeah, so many of these monuments were obviously built for the war to end all wars. And then they found they had to use another side of it for the 1939-45 war. Yeah. I also find quite powerful on this one, around the lower plinth, there is the inscription. I'm going to walk around just to make sure I don't miss a word. Greater love hath no man than this, that man lay down his life for his friends. Okay, well, plenty of women died too, but you get the idea. I have read, and it's quite an interesting read actually, about after the Second World War, the discussions and decisions that went on about how do we commemorate. I mean, it's not an automatic thing that every single village in Britain would have. I guess almost every village in Britain would have a war memorial. But it goes to show that there's barely a village, I would imagine, that didn't suffer a loss. And the decision was made that local villages, towns, cities would all have their war memorials, and you can still see them to this day. It's something I personally find very moving. My son's 21. It's funny, I sometimes when I used to turn up at football matches or athletic meets and think how lucky we were that we weren't. Actually, I'd have been way too old now. I'd have been in Dad's army with Captain Manring. But my son, 21, who to me is still a young man, but he'd have been one of the older new conscriptions, wouldn't he?
Yeah, definitely. He would have been one of the older ones. I wonder, there's a question though. Do you think that each village, if they had local artists or sculptors, they would have used them to make the memorials? Because Gill obviously was associated with Ditchling. So
yes.
Now I'm thinking I want to go and find out who's done the one, obviously from Brighton, Hove, and things. Because it's now interesting to wonder who did some of the other memorials.
See, it's interesting. See, the Brighton one isn't quite as powerful to me.
No.
But I mean, I think it is all local. It was local. Well, not always, because of course Gill also did some war memorials for other towns and cities around Britain.
Because that's so simple, Phil. Anyone just wandering past might not think, "Oh, that's an artist that's done that."
Yeah, exactly.
They would just think it was just someone in the village, stonemason, that's just kind of sorted that one out.
Like so just doing a tombstone.
Exactly. So now it's a really interesting point as to is there other artists that have done some of the other memorials then that we just don't know about?
That's why I think the cenotaph's very interesting, because there was a real discussion about what should this look like? Yeah. What do we call it? Where should it go?
Yeah.
And we now get used to it. We just. I mean, we're in the process of making a film about the history of the National Gallery. So in front of the National Gallery, you have Nelson's Column. We just accept Nelson's Column, but actually Nelson's Column, if you step back from it, is quite extraordinary. It's absolutely massive. You've got this admiral on top of it. And of course, in this day and age, and maybe now we come on to the biography, I mean, you can imagine people saying, we've got to take Nelson down, because, I mean, he was brutal. He was part of the British Empire. He was this, he was that. And of course, if you go through some of the statues in London, I mean, it's easy to say, well, Bomber Harris should go because, but then do you take down Churchill? You could end up with no statues at all. I'm not taking a position on it. I'm just saying if you start taking down statues and paintings of people involved in the British Empire, National Gallery is going to be half empty. This is slightly, is it slightly different? I mean, Gill, as I understand it, after he died, his diaries came to light, and he talks. Don't know why he would even write this stuff down, but he talks about abusing his 2 daughters, which is horrid. His dog, which is just absurd. Has an incestuous relationship with his sister, maybe with his second sister as well. His biography is, in Ditchling, where we are now, he lived not far from here, but then he moved slightly out of Ditchling and had this kind of community. His daughters didn't go to school. He was very religious, although there was a real kind of community sense to it. And he was an abuser. He was a sexual abuser and a paedophile. So should we even be talking about him? I mean, we did have this discussion. Should we even talk about this guy? Because but Janet, you were saying, well, if you start ignoring artists who have unpleasant biographies, you're going to cut half the canon.
It does bring us to the point that if we're talking about an artist, we should talk about his artwork and the expertise that has gone into his artwork. I mean, just take the Vermeer that you just recently made. It's the second film about Vermeer.
Third, in fact.
There you go. The third film. It's broken all box office records, and the big question is that you look at these lifelike pictures and wonder how he did it. We don't know about his private life, and if we do, we're disregarding it, but we're looking at the paintings. We're analysing the paintings, we're working out why he painted this wall a certain colour to highlight the person in front of it, and it hasn't come into how many breakfasts he had.
Okay, so if you are Jewish, will you listen to Wagner?
Yes. I mean, I had a Jewish mother, not that she was classically inclined, but Wagner's music is music, and I don't see. There could be a case that some Jewish people don't listen to Wagner because he was anti-Semitic, was he not?
He supported the Nazis,
if you like listening to music, then surely it's the music that speaks, not the person who wrote it.
What about, are you comfortable listening these days? I mean, maybe it's a slightly different subject. Well, it is different, but Russian musicians, Russian artists. What Russia is doing in Ukraine right now is appalling. So can we disassociate that from Russian artists, musicians, sports people?
That has started to affect me, I must say, and so I am in a little bit of a quandary over that. I haven't purposely listened to Russian music, but there are some lovely Russian composers, and so yes, that is a dilemma.
It's really tricky. What do you think?
Well, but going back to your point about the statues and should we take them all down and everything else, actually maybe nearby, maybe we should erect more statues, things, symbols that then would create the story around the person, so that therefore, instead of erasing the history, maybe we should be discussing the whole subject as a whole. And then maybe, because I don't necessarily think, to be fair, Phil, a few days ago I didn't really know Eric Gill. You mentioned him to me and I looked him up, and then I saw all this controversy. I was like, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't do this podcast today. But actually, maybe it's important that we do it and talk about the subjects that are now come to a head. I think it's quite good.
You see, for me, these statues, I think it's time that the statues of all these, like you walk around London, all these men on horseback and so on and so forth, I think it's time they all came down and we started putting up statues of artists and nurses and doctors. But that's just me.
But nearby, or take them down and then...
I think it's time to not celebrate military conquest anymore. And I'm somebody that's made films about military commanders and actually love reading about the British history, and I think the British Empire isn't kind of 100% black in its history, but
because there's going to be so much controversy about that subject, literally taking down some statues, we need to... I always get so caught up with this because I always feel that we have to balance, because otherwise it's just not going to work. So therefore I'm like, let's just go take them all down. But is there another way?
Context. You need...
Could we come back to the monument?
Yes.
Please, from the point of view that many people in the village will look at those names and think, yes, that was my grandfather. That was my former husband. There might be, I mean, I remember I lived through the war. My father was away in Palestine, actually. He was a British Army bandmaster, leaving my mother on her own in a country that wasn't hers, looking after two little girls while the bombs were coming over. And this may have been the case with a lot of the mothers, wives and children who were left behind whilst their sons, brothers went to war and were killed. And so they could be coming to this monument maybe just to look at the name, just to remember, yes, my brother, son, grandfather was in this war and there's his name.
Yes, so I would totally agree with you. I think that the way that this is designed makes the names the most prominent thing. It's not. There's no distraction. And even if you had a figure of Christ or a figure of Mary, there's still a little bit of the sculptor showing you what they can do. This is very clear. This is to remind you that almost 110 years ago, perhaps in some cases, these young men, it's all men on this particular memorial, went off to war and didn't come back. Coming back to the physical position that we're in, we're next to, and as I said, the Ditchling Museum of Art and Craft. I mean, obviously many people listening to this will know this, but in the villages and small towns and so on across the country, there are so many wonderful galleries that maybe some people don't pay enough attention to. I went to the Hove Museum the other day and saw it's a brilliant place. Lots of fantastic permanent exhibitions, like the history of film, which is tied up with Hove. But also they had a wonderful exhibition of Japanese woodcuts, which was brilliant. And they just hadn't marketed it. I mean, I only knew because somebody told me. This one, Ditchling Museum, Ditchling has a wonderful association with artists historically, and that's reflected here, plus the relationship with the Downs, the South Downs, the relationship with the sea. It's a wonderful place. And part of the reason I wanted to mention it and do a podcast, if not inside, just outside somewhere like this, is because for me, my first exposure, and I've mentioned this in one of our podcasts before, my first exposure to art and history and archaeology was walking from where we lived outside of Macclesfield into town, and along the way we'd go past a tiny little gallery, this little museum at the edge of a park. I must go back there one day. And my mum would take me in, and they had all these cabinets. Inside the cabinets were bits of old dinosaur and bits of old Roman pottery and who knows what. I was fascinated by it. Don't remember the paintings, to be honest. I just remember the cabinets and maybe, a skeleton of a bird or something. But it was fantastic, and it was free, and we'd wander in, and it didn't matter. We weren't a particularly wealthy background, but it didn't matter. Anyone could go in and anyone could be exposed to it. Same thing here. I mean, it's a wonderful resource. And I know you've both been before. Janet, you've been here before to the museum?
Yes, I have, yes. But I have to confess that I haven't been round the exhibition. Just went in the main part, not realising. And it is ticketed, so you have to be aware of that.
Is it or is it a donation? Do you have to pay to go in, or is it donations?
Some of the exhibitions are ticketed.
Oh yeah, some of the exhibitions are ticketed and some.
But the importance of them goes without saying, because what you've just said, Phil, about how as a child you went in and you were enthralled with those little tiny pieces of things and stuff like that. Clearly, that has influenced you and what you now do as a person. Even if you didn't end up being a documentary maker, it would have, even influenced the books you read, stuff like that. So it's completely important.
I mean, I'm sure teachers, thousands and thousands of teachers do this, but I mean, my junior school teacher was fantastic. We just used to go off and do all sorts of stories and it wasn't just about maths and learning how to read and all that. For example, we used to have free time, and my free time, I remember I used to copy the maps that were on the wall.
Right, good Lord.
And but copy them in the sense like, I wonder where, just maybe interested in travelling to these places.
Okay.
But you have to stimulate kids' imagination, and I know plenty of teachers and they work really, really hard. But if you don't get kids when they're young and get them interested in art or music, culture, history, local history, it's very tricky when they get to 17, 18, 19 to kind of stimulate that, don't you think?
Yes, well, I didn't go to one school in my young years. I think I was on my 9th school by the time I was 14.
Because your dad was in the army?
Yes, because he was in the army, and also when the war was over, 1945, 6 or thereabouts, I'm not sure whether my father came back from Palestine at the time, but I know my mother said, right, we got on a ship and went back to Egypt to visit her family. So that she hadn't seen her mother for 7 years, and that was probably my second school. And my sister and I went to the Lycée Français and learnt French, 2 years later, when we were back in England, my father's regiment was posted to Germany, so we were learning German.
Wow.
And
And
that
did
was
art-
about the 4th or 5th school.
And did art play any role at this?
Not really. I mean, I'm no artist. I don't want to be. I have no, I think when I joined the grammar school and went to the art class, the teacher said, do you want to learn to paint? And I said, no, not really. I'm not good at it, and I'm not. But I love reading books, and I'm a writer, and maybe what I write would engender a picture in somebody's mind from the way I write it.
Yeah, so painting pictures with words.
And your stories. I mean, I've
Well-
only just met you, Janet, and I could literally be with you for hours
Well,
and
just-
listen to your stories.
Just recently I've had some things put into magazines. I
Yeah.
mean, I think playing the lead role in the pantomime in Baghdad has been published in 3 separate magazines at
That's a
3
story.
times. and
I haven't got enough of these. This is brilliant.
Room for the next. That's the next podcast.
I got an
Baghdad or
article.
bust.
Yeah, I had an article published in Your Cat magazine, which had actually been
Your
rejected.
cat.
Your Cat is the name of the magazine. Your
Oh,
Cat.
okay.
Your cat.
Yes.
You don't have a cat.
No, but we did have a cat when we
Oh.
lived in Dallas. And when my husband said we're moving to Connecticut, we had this cat. And the lady across the road had sort of foisted it on us. And I said, well, only if you take it back if we have to leave here, because my husband was a company, had a company posting. So within 6 months we had to leave, and she said, I can't take your cat back. Why don't you take it with you? Well, my husband didn't want to pay for a flight for a mere cat. So we actually did what she said, and we drugged the poor little thing, put it in a cardboard box with holes in.
Sent it by the post.
No, we put it in the back seat of the car, and we were towing a motorboat. And so we had a 3-day journey to Connecticut with the cat. The cat had burst itself out of the box, so was sort of languishing on the back seat for 3 days. And on the first night we stayed with a friend, and we put the cat.
Janet, I'm going to stop you there because we've come a long way from Eric Gill.
I know, but yeah.
But
I mean,
isn't that even
so-
that's
But
actually
that's-
wonderful though, because
I'll
we
send you
started
a copy of the story. The editor made a double page spread of it.
Very good. Well,
I love that.
back with Eric and I mean, it's a
To edit that out, I'm sorry.
No, we're not editing.
it's a wonderful war memorial. If you're ever in Ditchling, it's just off the main street. It's right next to the gallery. I can't recommend Ditchling Museum of Art and Craft enough. And Gill, well, black and white, but plenty of shades of grey in there too. It's an interesting question about, his biography and things, it's dreadful. But I think we can still admire his war memorial. I know that some of think it should be taken down because of his background. I still have to kind of think about that myself. But anyway, that's Painting of the Week for this week, and we'll be back soon. Just to remind you though, if you go to 7th-art.com, there's plenty of other materials there. This is our 59th podcast, so you should be able to listen to all the old ones. And we're just finishing our 35th exhibition on screen, Klimt and the Kiss. And I think 33 of the previous ones are on the website for you to watch, and plenty of other things too. So thank you for listening. Do share with your friends if you've enjoyed our podcast and think they might enjoy it too. And we'll be back soon. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Painting of the Week podcast. For more information, please visit our website at 7th-art.com or contact us by emailing info@7th-art.com. See you next time.